Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded. The title of this presentation is Funding Options Forum. My name is Kelly Byrne, and I am from the Kansas State Department of Education, and it is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this session. We are scheduled to conclude this session by 11:15. I am pleased to introduce the presenter for this session, Dean Zeitz. Dean is the state and federal programs coordinator for the Special Education and Title Services team of the Kansas State Department of Education. Dean helps oversee the Kansas Integrated Accountability System, provides training and technical assistance to Kansas school districts on IDEA and ESEA fiscal requirements, MTSS implementation, blending and braiding of programs, disproportionality analysis, and best practices to achieve results for all students. Dean serves on the board of directors of the Association of Educational Federal Finance Administrators and is the president-elect of the National Association of ESEA Program Administrators and has served as an expert reviewer for the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dean.
All right, thank you, Kelly, and thank you for the welcome and the my bio. Anyway, so welcome everyone to the first breakout of this year's KSDE conference, Great Ideas in Education, and so happy that for those of us that chose to join today's conversation, because I do think it'll be an interesting conversation as we dive a little bit into what we've titled the Funding Options Forum, but what it really is all about is having a nice, more introductory primer that's geared more towards educators and administrators at the local level on some of the practical things that you can do as you are trying to match up your local resources with these great ideas, and really kind of help bridge that gap between program and fiscal so that you can then go on to implement these things that we want to see to make education better and more inclusive. So we're going to go through today with just a little bit of a primer first on the different sources of revenue, but then pretty quickly delve into some specific concepts to enable you to have better conversations with both your administrators as well as with the state or others as you're trying to articulate your ideas and plans going forward, as well as some specific considerations to help inform your conversations when you do run into obstacles along the way. And throughout all of this, please feel free to put questions into the chat. We'll be kind of pausing along the way to answer questions or to engage in discussion, because we really do want this to be a two-way conversation. And then we'll also have some opportunities a little bit further towards the end to go through and go through some specific scenarios, or we would also welcome any specific questions or scenarios that any of you would like to pose once we get to that point. And I will note too, I see a number of our colleagues are also joining as participants today, and so I will invite them as well to insert their comments in chat or to answer questions in chat as well as we go along if necessary. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right on in. All right, so first up, let's just talk for a moment about what are the three big pots of funding when we talk about funding for education in Kansas. And again, we're keeping this fairly high level because of the audience that this conference primarily serves. But we thought it would be important to talk a little bit about one, local revenue, which tends to be kind of your most flexible funding, that aid that is generated at the local level through property taxes or other funds. But then your state aid, which is composed of both general state aid, which is what we think of with that base state aid or per pupil funding, which does include some weightings for different sorts of things, whether it's special education or poverty or transportation, different weightings that do increase the overall amount, but it's still money that spends pretty fluidly on kind of whatever is allowable under education within your district. But then we also have some more restricted state aid, such as your special education categorical aid, or like your pre-K at risk, or your 4-year-old at risk or 3-year-old at risk funds, as well as your more general at risk funds. Those are some state funded programs that can only be in which those funds can only be used for certain things, certain cost objectives, and may have other restrictions. And then finally, your federal aid, which encompasses everything from like your Individuals with Disability Education Act funds, your IDA money, your Elementary and Secondary Education Act aid, their ESEA, and so that's things like what we think of Title I, or which support Title II, which supports professional development, Title III, support for English learners, et cetera. And then, of course, we will also talk a little bit about ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Aid, that, of course, is a significant source of funding in our current environment. And then, of course, you also have other things like Perkins and other federal funds as well, although we won't be talking quite as much about those today. And again, for the most part, we're going to be talking more about concepts and general rules that apply to all federal funds. So it's not going to be necessary to get into the weeds of any one of those. Okay, so before we move into some of these more general concepts, I thought it would be useful for a lot of you to talk a little bit about just what federal funds are even out there for Kansas schools. And this is one of those slides that definitely breaks the PowerPoint slide rule, and that is why there's both the QR code that you can snap a picture of, or you can go in to Sched and actually download this PowerPoint and click on the link. But what we have here is the current breakout of federal educational funding through the U.S. Department of Education that's coming into Kansas, as well as the projected estimates for next year. I will note on this that those years, those are federal fiscal years, which means that when you see 2020, that's the 2021 school year. 2021 is the 2021-2022 school year, et cetera. It's a little bit different from how we refer to school years, fiscal years here at the state level. But couple things I want to point out here, even though this is at a state level, so it doesn't translate completely into what you would see at your district level, but we want you to be aware of some of the different regular formula funding sources that exist, just to have this on your radar and to
Dean, somehow you've got muted.
Thank you, Tate. I don't know how long I was talking there before that happened. I don't know how that happened.
It's been about maybe 30 seconds to a minute at most.
Okay. All right. Well, that's one way to shut me up. Okay. Anyway, we'll can't keep it moving along here, but yeah. So we thought it was helpful to have the general list available so that you would know, at least have on your radar what some of the different funding streams are coming into school districts in Kansas, whether that is for ESCA for supports for at-risk learners on the federal side, special education funds, funds for after-school programs, et cetera. But it's also kind of helpful for today's context to look at that bottom line number with the subtotals of, when we talk about all of the ESCA and so your title programs and all of your IDA, so your federal special education funding, as well as like career tech ed, your Perkins stuff, all of that together is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $350 million per year in federal aid for Kansas. So keep that number in mind. Every year, what we're used to is about $350 million for these big federal programs that support the state. So with that in mind, let's take a quick look at, there we go, the extra federal aid that's coming in as part of CARISA, ARP, and the CARES Act. This is the emergency relief aid that we frequently reference, and that's our ESSER 1, 2, and 3. And first thing I want to point out is that while ESSER 1 was a mere $85 million, it was huge at the time, but by today's standards now, it feels very small. We have ESSER 2, which was passed back in December of 2020, which brought in $370 million of additional aid for our state. And then only a few months later, in March, we have the additional $830 million in federal aid that was brought in by ESSER 3. And add into that, with ARP, we also had an additional $28 million in regular special education aid, which actually brings it up to closer to $855 million. And that's not even including these EANS programs, which support non-public schools. But all that to say that, of course, over the next couple of years, because you do have, like for ESSER 3, you do have until September 30th of 2024 to spend down this aid. We are at a time where there is a significant one-time surge in funding and supports to be utilized in the state to support education. And while this does, in the case of ESSER and EANS, it does have to be targeted towards COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic, as well as addressing learning loss and other consequences of the pandemic. It is also an opportunity to use to both meet those objectives and also invest in ways that have long-term benefits to your programs. So let's connect some of these. So we've talked a little bit about the resources, but let's maybe talk now a little bit about how we connect those resources to these big ideas and great ideas in education. So I like to say that there's usually no one way to accomplish a task. This is a picture from a pathway. I was walking one day I think it was at a conference in DC, I think, but just walking out a pathway, and they put up these two barriers on the path to keep vehicles and things off of it. But what I thought was interesting was, as I come to the other end of the path, they managed to achieve this exact same result with just the single bar in the middle. So there's always while there's not one way to achieve things, there's always a better way. And so, and that goes with with federal funding as well. There's a lot of different ways that we can think about rethinking how we pair up our resources so that we can be more effective, not just it's not just about efficiency of funding, but about better integration and collaboration of our different programs so that we provide better services to our students and get better outcomes. But let's talk a little bit about what does that look like in school districts, because it's never quite as easy as that, is it? We like to talk about things like blending and braiding, but when the rubber hits the road, sometimes that gets kind of messy. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how each of the funding streams, whether they're state or federal, do come with specific purposes and limitations. But really, if you understand 6 core concepts, that will really help you better understand and devise strategies to leverage those resources and to address specific barriers and questions that may come up as you're trying to identify both the resources available to you to utilize for a particular program, as well as how to effectively integrate those resources. And as we're kind of going through this, it's also important to understand that, from an auditor perspective, the world is very black and white, right? It's either allowable or not. And that can be true of whether you're an auditor at the state level, it's the outside CPAs that come in and monitor districts, or other program monitors. But in the real world, of course, it's not necessarily black and white. There's a lot of there can be a lot of gray, and that's why when you call the state, a lot of times someone will say, well, can I use ESSER funds to pay for FastBridge? And we say, well, it depends. Context matters. If you were already providing it, can you pay for it now? Probably not. But if it's something new, maybe. And really, even the black and white, it's the real world is actually probably even more like this. It's really that full color spectrum. There's just a lot of variation, and that context always matters. And what we're going to kind of talk through now is with these core concepts is when we say context matters, we really, it's helpful to understand what it is that we are looking at here at the state level, because sometimes it may feel like we're just kind of making this stuff up. But in almost every situation, when someone comes to us with a question of, can I do this with the money? Or can I use this fund to support, this activity? What we're doing in our heads is running through those a few very specific tests or questions that really inform whether or not something's allowable. So let's kind of run through this. And this isn't the complete list of everything that you need to go through for federal funds, but these 6 concepts, if you get these, everything else is really pretty in the weeds and a little bit more minor. This is the main stuff right here. So first up, this is probably one of the most important, this core concept of supplement, not supplant. So for most of your federal grants and some of your state programs, the funds can only be utilized to do something new. It's for something in addition to what you already had, or to do something you wouldn't have otherwise done. And the whole idea with this really dates back to the very first big anti-poverty program, anti-poverty education program passed in about 1965 by Lyndon Johnson in the Congress at that time, which was the predecessor to what we think of as Title I. And in that first big funding bill that passed, it was only about a paragraph long. I mean, it was barely half a page. There wasn't much to it. And it was essentially Congress said, here is millions of dollars, go out and address poverty in your schools. And what happened was, because there weren't any restrictions or limitations, a lot of states said, thank you very much. They took it and they just used that to pay for the same stuff they were paying for last time and just save their local and state money. And then Congress said, well, wait, that's not why we gave you this money. We gave it to you to make things better, not to just keep doing what you were already doing. So then you start getting these extra requirements and all those other rules and things that kind of get layered on over time. But the key concept is this supplement, not supplant. Is it something, are you using these federal dollars to provide something new and different that wasn't already in place as part of your old program? And our next concept that we want to talk about is allocable, or the proportionality. So here, what we're looking at is when you do have additional federal aid or maybe a particular category of state funds, and you have an activity that could be paid for out of different things, is the investment from each source, is it proportional to the benefit? And let me give a concrete example, because that can sound really, really fuzzy. So for instance, if you have a special education teacher who, as part of his duties, works a lunch hour shift of just supervising the classroom, not to provide any kind of special education or IEP related service, but rather just to provide overall support to the kiddos in the lunchroom for that hour. In that scenario, that 1 hour is not special education, and so it couldn't reasonably be charged to the special education funds, even though maybe the rest of their day could be. And so in this case, what you would want to do is track that time separately, so that you're only paying for the portion of time that is lunchroom duty out of some other non-special education funds, even though everything else could be. So that's where you get like your timesheets, or what we sometimes call time and effort or personnel activity reports. And our next concept, objective overlap. And we sometimes call this incidental benefit. And the idea here is that you occasionally have different programs where they can have the same objective or similar populations that can be served out of these funds. And so unlike what we just talked about just a moment ago, here you could actually have someone who is paid out of multiple sources, but you don't have to parse it out with proportionally, because any one of those funds could be used to pay for the activity. So for instance, like with if you had a preschool teacher who was providing who was qualified to provide special education services and was providing them, that could potentially be paid for out of special education funds, but depending on what they were doing, they may also be paid out of other pre-K at-risk funds, or Kansas preschool pilot funds, or any state general funds, or any number of other sources. And then next, the core concept that things must be data-driven. And this is especially true of federal funds that actually have this as an explicit requirement. And what this means is that when we're talking about services funded with federal dollars, that the performance needs to be measured in some way so that we can assess whether or not the activity is actually having the desired effect and improving outcomes for children. And particularly in the case of like ESEA funds, or for like the 20% set aside for ESSER 3 funds, there are some of these, there are some of those funds that actually require even a higher tier of evidence to demonstrate that the things that are being paid for out of those funds are both evidence-based, as well as then you do either way need to measure the effect and actually see if they're having the result that you intended. And if not, hopefully we're adjusting the system so that you do have a more positive impact. And then our core concept of prior approval. This is in some ways one of the most basic ones, but something that folks probably don't utilize as much as they could. And the basic premise here is that if you're not sure about something, if you have an activity that falls in that gray area, if you ask for prior approval, and actually if you would get prior written approval and from an appropriate KSD staff member, and that's why these are highlighted and underlined. If you get prior written approval from the appropriate KSD staff member, that's effectively a safe harbor for you come monitoring or auditing time, because and this is something that's actually addressed in the law. It's not just something that KSD is making up, but rather this ensures that KSDE has had an opportunity to ask whatever follow-up questions we think may be necessary, and to make a final determination, and then can provide that in writing, which will protect you come audit time, or again, as part of a state or federal monitoring. Now, prior written approval means that you might get a no. We might look at it and say, well, no, we can't okay that, but at least you know ahead of time. Or conversely, you may come to us and ask, can I pay for this with ESSER dollars, or can I do this activity or whatever. And sometimes we might not be able to say yes the way you've framed it, but we may be able to give you some practical ideas on how you could do it, and then point you in the right direction. So this is one that we really try to encourage, is reach out when you're not sure, and we will work with you. And with respect to the appropriate KSD staff member, we recognize that it can be difficult from the district perspective to sometimes understand who is the right person to ask. But here, the main thing is that if for instance, you had a question about Title I or an ESA program, you'd want to make sure that you got a response from someone who's actually oversees that program. So like Tate Tateman or Doug Boleen or others. Similarly, like with IDA, whether it's myself or Brian or Bert Moore, it's important to have someone who actually is has program oversight of those funds. You wouldn't want to just rely on, no disrespect to our very, very intelligent assistants and everyone else in our agency. You wouldn't want to, it wouldn't be sufficient just to get an email back from them. You need to actually have it from a program officer. All right. And then our last core concept is the reasonable person standard or stranger test. And this is another one that in some ways it seems kind of common sense, but it's probably not one that a lot of folks really, it's probably one that folks really do seem to have kind of a sometimes difficult wrapping their head around objectively. And the test here is, and again, this is actually in law, is that if a cost is, before a cost can be deemed reasonable, it needs to be something that the amount and the type of cost needs to be something that a prudent person under the same circumstances or similar circumstances would make. And one of the best ways to kind of gauge this would be to, if you're kind of in that gray area, or if you're not sure about something, talk to your colleagues in other districts to kind of get their sense, just to get an idea of what others might do. Or again, feel free to reach out to KSDE. You also want to watch for things that would significantly deviate from your regular district practices. And kind of a practical example of all this would be, so for instance, there's been a lot of talk recently about providing additional premium pay. That's out of ESSER funds or other federal or state aid. And that's paid to do something that you wouldn't have otherwise normally done, or to retain staff, or to take on additional risk or work, et cetera. And there's a variance in how much might be appropriate, or what folks are offering in different districts. And you may find that for instance, is a retention incentive, is it appropriate to give everyone $500 each to stay, or $5,000 to stay, or $50,000? At what point does it become unreasonable? It's something else for you to consider as you are thinking about which funds to use for different programs. Okay, so now let's transition a little bit and talk about with those 6 concepts in mind, how do you use those concepts then to overcome critical questions or challenges as you're matching up those resources to a specific intervention or idea or innovation? And we're going to go through a few just very specific examples to kind of help you think through this. So for instance, this is one of the major ones that we see. Concerns, the audit concerns. So you're in a district or in your school, and you've got this great idea, and you're pretty sure and you've got the funds lined up and everything, but you're told that that might be allowable, but we've had bad experiences in the past, or we've got this past monitoring finding from 10 years ago. And it's just not worth the risk. It's not worth the challenge. What if we do it and it comes back and we end up having to send the funds back? And so this is a good example where we would suggest using that prior approval concept. So what you could do is actually get that prior approval in writing from KSDE, pose a question to KSDE. The worst thing we could say is no. But if we do say yes and we provide that in writing, then the district is safeguarded and you're safe to move forward. Next up, loss of focus. So this is that concern that if you're expanding a particular intervention or service to include a larger group or providing the support or intervention as part of a bigger program, think about the difference between just special education services and meeting an IEP goal to thinking about how special education can be one of many components fitting into a multi-tiered system of support, an MTSS program, as well as ESCA Title I programs and other interventions. And when you do that, what kinds of, are we taking the focus too far off of a particular group or cost objective? And so here, what you can look at is, one, the data-driven elements. Are you collecting data to ensure that those different subgroups or populations that are supposed to be supported with each of those federal funds, are we actually still improving outcomes as part of whatever this bigger support and intervention is? Proportionality, if it's designed to support, if you're paying for a particular reading intervention out of a combination of special education or ESCA or other state or federal funds and ESSER funds, whatever, is the proportion that you're using out of each of those funds, is it proportional to the benefit to those populations as part of the services being provided? And then, of course, objective overlap, where you have those opportunities to use multiple funds because the overall objective lines up. Providing good professional development to your staff is something that could be done out of both ESCA Title II and potentially out of ESSER funds, depending on what you're doing. So it may simply be that they are aligned on what they are on the things that you could use them for, which would allow you to move forward. Sort of related to that, we have that concern about loss of funding. The concern that while it might otherwise be allowable, rearranging the services might decrease your overall program revenue. And this comes up a lot, particularly around early childhood or with special education categorical aid. And some of the suggestions that we would look at here is, one, the data concept, and that's one where when we talk about data, the data-driven concept here, it's because you may, if you can lose sight of the forest for the trees here. You may find yourself where, yes, we may decrease this particular amount of revenue that we're going to generate from categorical aid as an example by some amount. But are we so focused on that little data point of just how much categorical aid we're going to lose here that we're losing sight of the larger benefit to the program and to the students overall? Are we actually looking at how much, like actually putting a dollar value to what you might be losing by aligning the services versus long-term costs of additional intervention and supports to students down the road if you didn't have a more integrated service? So that's important, as well as, again, looking at that proportionality, objective overlap, prior approval, going out and finding out, are we going to lose funding, or can we get prior approval on that? And then, of course, the stranger test to make sure that whatever you're doing is it reasonable if you were in a different district? Is this something that an outsider would come in and say that what you're doing is reasonable and necessary given the circumstances that you're operating in? And then another one that comes up a lot is things that are not allowable. And this can tie back a lot to, again, sometimes it's previous findings that you may have received within the district or based on different guidance that may be floating around out there, sometimes from the state, sometimes not. Sometimes it's just things that have kind of been traded around for years, and it's just kind of out there. And this, I will say too, this kind of goes both ways, both the not allowable or Conversely, sometimes you see things that say that they're allowable, be like, I don't know if I can really do that. So here again, the number one way to address that is simply to request that prior approval from KSDE and get it in writing as to whether or not in your specific context, whether or not that would be allowed. And this is one that so for this critical question, this is the reticent to change roles. And we see, and this is more in the educator world, and we're going to talk about on the administrator side here in a moment as well. But this is those, when you have that systems change, that reluctance sometimes of an educator or any other staff member to take on a different role within the system, maybe mean working with a different group of students, or to shift teaching from pull out to more itinerant services, or it could be some kind of a transition to co-teaching with other educators. And similar to that loss of funding concept, what we would recommend here is really focusing on that data-driven aspect. And we understand that this one's a little bit more complicated, but when you do ask an educator to change what they're doing, having the data not just to support why it should be effective if it's done with fidelity, but actually having then the ongoing data to show that it is effective can really reinforce those changes and support the new system once it's up and running. We're coming to the end of these. So similar to that, we have that reluctance to change of systems at the administrator level. Again, this gets back to kind of it's a common challenge to systems realignment is sometimes that human component and reticence to change or take on new systems. And again, here we would talk about the using the data just like we would for the educators. I'm kind of going through this a little bit faster just because we want to be respectful of folks' time and want to give us a chance to actually talk a little bit about this. Okay, so we're going to move on to some scenarios and discussion. And before I do, see, have we had any questions or any comments in the chat, Kelly?
No, not yet.
Okay. Very good. All right. Okay, so for this next part, we're going to just go through a couple. And so this is an opportunity for folks to kind of join the conversation and chime in here. So our first one, we're going to see what people think, and you can feel free to put this in the chat. But incidental benefit: can a service required by one student's IEP be a non-special education intervention for another student? So let's kind of keep this. Let's start with that first question. And I know you didn't realize that you were going to get a special education quiz as we were getting into this, but let's just start with that. So no, what do people think? Can a service required by one student's IEP be a non-special that same intervention? Could it be a non-special education intervention for another student, like in an MTSS model? Feel free to put that in the chat. Nobody wants to be the first. There we go. All right. Thank you, Randall. Randall gives it a thumbs up. So, oh, and Dee Dee says yes. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, Dee Dee, Randall, yes. It could be. And of course, this, like everything else, context matters. And so that doesn't mean that it's always going to be true that that would be appropriate, but it could be. Okay, so with that in mind, knowing that you might have some situations where the same intervention could both meet a student's IEP needs as well as another student's in other intervention needs, whether it's through like a small group reading intervention or what have you. With that in mind, could you have a non-identified student, so a student who's not on IEP, or we'll keep it simple. We'll just have a student who's not on IEP. Could they who would otherwise benefit from that particular reading intervention? Could they join in the could they join in the reading intervention that a special education teacher was providing, as long as it doesn't take away from that IEP service? So again, like for this scenario, let's think about a small reading intervention group of just a few kids. Do we think that that might be something that would be allowed as incidental benefit? Oh, yes. Mary Ellen says yes. Dee Dee says, would it depend on how the students with disability services are listed in the IEP? That's a good question. Context does matter. We also sometimes get the question of, well, is it okay for one student who's not identified to participate, but what about 2 or 3 or 4? At what point is it not reasonable anymore? So yes, good question. So yeah, and the answer here is yes, it could be okay, and we actually do see this a lot, particularly like in MTSS models. It's not required that you include other students, and it won't. And in every situation, it's not a good idea. It really depends about the context of the particular intervention and the student, but it is a place where if you can both serve one student with the federal funds that you were going to provide services to anyway, and another student or students can participate without diminishing that benefit, there's really not an issue there. And like we kind of are, this one actually kind of touches, I already kind of alluded to this because we talked about the reading group, but so we won't spend a lot of time on this, but yeah, this kind of goes into a little further explanation of that same intervention. If we had an MTSS program that identified a student as part of MTSS that needs a reading intervention to help catch up to his peers, and we have another student, Jane, who was already going to be receiving that particular intervention as part of our IEP, and there may be some opportunities there to align those services. Now, and obviously with a lot of this stuff, it does start to get tricky once you get the individual logistics may make that prohibitive in some cases, but the idea here is that we also want to open up opportunities so that as you're considering how best to structure your supports or new programs or your environment, you are considering all the resources, all your staff, and thinking about how it can all work together. So let's talk for a moment about district professional development activities. A district wants to use ESSER funds to provide training to staff on how to better serve students with disabilities through the use of differentiated supports. Because we know that our students with disabilities were one of our most disproportionately impacted groups through the pandemic. So if we're using ESSER funds to help staff better serve students with disabilities using differentiated supports, who else in the district might be able to participate? Do we think it's only special education staff, or might others be able to participate as well? Dee Dee says that students with disabilities are general education students first, and so I would think that all could participate. I think that's certainly a fair argument there, Dee Dee. Or all who are appropriate. So yeah, and I wonder, so, Dee Dee says, yeah, all who are appropriate. So it kind of depends on, depending on what the kind of training is, because, obviously if it's differentiated supports, but differentiated supports for, specific to say preschool or elementary students, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean you want all staff to participate, but it doesn't mean that only special education staff could participate. Yeah, or Cindy Couchman. Yes, it has to be job related. So yes, so there's still variations to all of this, but the idea being that that you could kind of open it up. So even though you're supporting, ultimately this is being done to support students with disabilities, there are a number of different professionals in your district that could participate and benefit from the opportunity without having to bring in different funds. And let's do one more. Let's do one more example here. District is expanding their special education preschool program to now be open to all children. And the expanded program is funded through a combination of pre-K at risk, special education funds, as well as parent fees. The district had previously provided transportation for students with disabilities and wants to make busing available to new students, but is concerned it would jeopardize the special education funding. And so, I think here, what we're talking about is the categorical aid that districts receive for transportation for students with disabilities. So, any thoughts on that, on how a district might address that or overcome that concern? Yeah, so Lisa says, could you prorate the busing cost? So yeah, pay for parts of it out of special education, but if you're bringing in other kiddos and as well as looking at blending or braiding the different funding streams, could part of that funding come out of the pre-K at risk, some of it maybe out of the fees that parents pay, other funds. Good suggestion there, Lisa. And in all cases, then that just opens it up so that more kiddos can participate and access these resources without having to duplicate it by having a separate bus route for, say, our at-risk kiddos or for the other children. Good suggestion. All right, let's go ahead and I'm going to pause again for a moment. So, are there any specific either scenarios that folks want to ask about, or any specific question or any questions from what we've covered so far? And we've got a number of KSDE folks on today. So if you have any particular questions about something you're thinking about, whether it's with ESSER funds or your title or even your state at-risk dollars or whatever, you've got a good group on to run things by. If you just want to throw out a hypothetical, we like hypotheticals. So it's the other district down the street, not necessarily you. Okay, well, okay, here's one. Oh, that's a good one. So Lisa asked, Lisa is asking about, feedback on the possibility of wellness programs for staff from ESSER funds. So yeah, and of course, with everything, context matters, but when you're talking about wellness programs and you're talking about ESSER aid, and I will note too, I'm going to plug this, on Thursday at 9:45, Tate Tateman, Doug Boleen, and myself we are going to have a session on managing resources and maximizing results, and we'll get a little bit more into the weeds of specifically what you can do with ESSER funds and utilizing those. So do watch for that. But yes, with ESSER funds, because one of the allowable uses that pertains to all the ESSER funds is supporting mental health of both students and staff, as well as looking at that long-term continuity of operations, which again ties back to healthy, happy, well-supported staff. There are a number of ways that you could use ESSER funds to support the wellness of staff and different support programs. In fact, that is something that we have seen a number of districts propose, both with ESSER 1 funds as well as going forward with ESSER 2 aid. So I think that's probably a pretty good fit, Lisa. Any others? Okay. Well, so as we're kind of wrapping up here, I do want to share a few more resources with you for future consumption. First of which, and these are also included, I think the actual PDF is actually included with the materials for this presentation, but you can also just snap a picture of that QR code and go to it directly. But the U.S. Department of Education, through their National Comprehensive Centers, recently put out it's about 115-page or so resource on strategies for using American Rescue Plan funding. That's your ESSER 3 aid, but it does a really nice job of providing some specific examples of different one-time sort of initiatives or opportunities that might give you that would allow you to make good use of these additional federal dollars that are coming in right now, but that would pay long-term benefits. And some of these things are ideas that districts are already implementing within our state, but there's a lot of other things there too that you might see that will maybe generate some good local conversations. We also always want to include a slide anymore about report of fraud, waste, and fraud, wasted, abuse. That actually should be fraud, waste, and abuse, not wasted. But at any rate, if of course you do, we do encourage folks to post these posters from the Office of Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Education, either somewhere around your district, or just to have this information available. And it's because we do want to make sure that if there are ever instances of fraud, waste, or abuse, that it does get reported, because these are funds that are out here to support students. And we do know that whenever there is a significant surge in federal funding, that unfortunately sometimes good people do make poor decisions, and that only happens more frequently when there's a lack of oversight. So we do try to make sure that folks are aware that there are ways to report suspected fraud, waste, and abuse anonymously, as well as to get resources if you do have any concerns or questions. Oh, and can you email out this flyer to post on our website? Yes. Yeah, Lisa, that's a great suggestion. We'll work with the school finance team and see about getting that included in one of the upcoming interest letters, as well as get it out through other means as well. So good suggestion, Lisa. Appreciate that. All right. Well, if there's, I'll pause for a moment because we're coming right up to the end. I think we timed this pretty well. But any other questions or comments? Okay, well, we appreciate you all joining us this morning, and I think you get a few minutes break before your next session at 11:30. I believe that's right, Kelly?
Yes, it is.
All right,
and I hope everybody will join me in thanking Dean for sharing your expertise, Dean, and during this session. And we also encourage all of our participants to provide feedback on the session via Sched. There's a spot for providing feedback.
right. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you all, and please enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of the conference. Thank you. Goodbye.